I Want to Believe. Section: What Exists Cannot Be True. In March of 1972, Adolfo Gili was freed after 6 years in a panopticon known throughout Mexico as the Black Palace, but he had made the most of it. From the start, his comrades launched solidarity campaigns that convinced the jailers to let political prisoners self-organize en blocs as an autonomous zone, rarely entered by guards. Quote, "We emptied out one cell to use as a kitchen, pooled all resources and materials, TV, newspapers, books from outside. One prisoner even managed to get a piano brought in. It was wheeled down the corridor by 4 guards." End quote. Inside the free territory of Lecumberi, he reread the works of Hegel, Marx, Lenin, and Trotsky in chronological order, studied Mexican history, and even wrote a best-selling book, The Revolution Interrupted, today considered the most important work on the history of the Mexican Revolution from a leftist perspective. Quote, "Of course it was unjust that I was there at all," Gili told New Left Review. Quote, "But the regime was almost like a monastery. It was good to be insulated from all the turbulence of political praxis. Which deputy voted how, getting leaflets out, and so on." End quote. After a few years, reintegrated to the deepening sectarianism and insistence on secrecy, security, and blind discipline of the Poseras International, he admitted, quote, "I had felt much freer in prison." End quote. Police escorted him to Benito Juarez Airport and put him on a plane to France, where he received a hero's welcome. Almeida recalled his arrival as a renewal of hope for the movement. Despite Poseras' worsening mania, the International had stabilized in Europe, and their reach was arguably wider than ever. Small new sections were emerging in Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, South Yemen, Germany, and Switzerland, with sympathizers corresponding from Syria, Yugoslavia, China, Romania, Japan, Madagascar, Somalia, Libya, and Congo. Gili could offer some respectability to the movement in this modest phase of expansion, and, having stayed out of the controversies of the International, could perhaps temper their leaders' worst instincts. For the time, however, Gili dutifully conformed. David Douglas remembered him teaching at a cadre school in England. After the long day of lectures, he was disgusted to see Douglas and his comrades opening beers, criticizing them for, quote, lumpen drinking. Later that night, as the cadre got ready to sleep, Gili became even more agitated. Quote, "What was going on?" Douglas remembered Gili asking, quote, "Male comrades and female comrades together? In the same room together? This isn't a hippie festival. We can't have mixed sexes together, all together. This is degenerate." End quote. After the school, Douglas's cadre quit the movement, preferring to stick to their bohemian roots over Poseras asceticism. With similar origins, how had Gili's wild intellect been so successfully tamed? The simplest explanation is that he was brainwashed. Illegible in the bizarre and repetitive transcriptions of Poseras' speeches, many ex-militants said, were the hypnotic elements of their performance: dramatic rhythm, humor, and musicality. The effect was heightened in one-on-one sessions during congresses or cadre schools, calling to mind the charismatic techniques of L. Ron Hubbard's parapsychological, quote, audits, Jim Jones' mixture of empathetic salesmanship and gospel, or Marshall Applewhite's soul-piercing confidence. Leone recalled, beginning of long quote, "Meetings with Poseras often became psychoanalytic sessions. Somewhat like a confessor, a little priest. Militants walked away feeling that Poseras had some incredible insight into their character. He knew them better than they knew themselves. This allowed Poseras in subsequent sessions to deform the interpretation to suit his interests. If a militant was distressed, it was because they weren't committing themselves enough to the cause. If they were happy, it was because their militancy was bringing them joy, and thus they were given more tasks." End of quote. even when Gilly and the other intellectuals were not entirely spellbound. In the first years of the International, there was at least a method to the madness. The strangeness of Poseres was worth his working-class intuition, motivational ability, tireless organizing, and absorption of his intellectuals' positions. What began to trouble many in the inner circle, especially Almeida, was Poseres' quote, theoretical shortcut of interpreting any political development or quick shift in government as evidence of the kind of rapid socialist development he promised was occurring. An extreme example was his analysis of 1973 developments within the military junta in Greece. The army had killed dozens of students to quell an uprising at the Athens Polytechnic, but elements of the junta thought they had been too soft and slow to act. Somehow, and against the opinion of his Greek comrades, Poseres interpreted the subsequent elevation of more barbaric generals as a potentially revolutionary development. Quote, "The weak reaction of the junta against the students. It indicates that they want to support the students. There's an internal struggle inside the military junta, but it still has not resulted in the final decision, or the absolute power, of the sector that wants to develop the economy, at the expense of the alliance with the king, with the landowners, with the church, and with imperialism." End quote. Poseres had always sought to align with powerful figures, but seeking out truly odious bedfellows like the fascistic Greek junta was unacceptably naive. In what Almeida describes as another, quote, phase of delirium, Poseres sent him to Libya to meet with Muammar Gaddafi and to Syria to support Baathism, Arab national populism, which Poseres supported without distinguishing between its socialist tendencies and the right authoritarians that came to power, such as Hafez al-Assad in Syria or Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Even the coup against Allende in Chile was a positive sign. Poseres believed that the senseless brutality with which General Augusto Pinochet overthrew a democratically elected government would inspire a global revolution that would help bring the imaginary Communist International of masses into being. The Poseres press put out a call for all worker states, parties, and unions to convene a world conference and form international brigades to aid the resistance struggle against the Chilean junta. Almeida knew it was an empty gesture. The tide had turned violently against the left everywhere in Latin America, and worst of all, Poseres had no ability to adjust his thinking to that reality. Quote, "Defining the event as a defeat was equivalent to wishing for it," Leone wrote, thus joining forces with the enemy. End quote. Poseres' increased certainty that world revolution was nigh, and that he was a key thinker motivating that process, came with a deepening paranoia that agents of imperialism were plotting against him. In a speech on Trotsky's death to his inner circle, Poseres blamed Joseph Hansen, Trotsky's secretary, for allowing the compound to be infiltrated. Quote, "There are similar features in our worries," he told them, implying members of his own team might be just as incompetent, if not agents themselves. The bloodletting began at the Ninth World Congress in 1973. It was held in the surreally Gothic setting of a long-abandoned castle in the French countryside, lent by a journalist friend of Sendik in the hopes the Congress would go unnoticed by the authorities. Militants were instructed to take further precautions, such as avoiding the nearby village and only entering the castle in small groups at night. Uncleaned since the war and lacking electricity, the first days of the Congress were spent dusting and clearing cobwebs and beehives by torchlight. As they cleaned, they came across relics of its last occupants, German soldiers. Paul Schultz translated one of their letters, explaining how they had retreated in haste after being ambushed by local partisans. Once the days of cleaning were complete, the militants celebrated with their traditional soccer tournament. Cheers echoed throughout the valley in at least 6 languages, concerning the villagers below. When the police came, writer Nicole Guardiola of the French section and actor Jordi Daudet of the Spanish section, improvised the story that they were preparing a television series with a diverse European cast set in the castle. Although the story was accepted, Poseidus was badly shaken. Quote, "A good chunk of the non-Italian Poseidus living in Italy in those years had escaped their countries of origins, and had false passports and IDs," Dondero wrote. Quote, "Some had already been sentenced to jail." The tension caused Poseidus' paranoia to finally boil over. Quote, "In all the international, there's developing a process of crisis," he announced. The blame went to, quote, "the old cadres above all. These cadres that have not developed in discipline, in confidence, in the meaning of the discipline," end quote. The first target was Gabriel Leblanc, Diego, a Uruguayan architect living in Paris. A veteran of the BLA, he was a tall, well-dressed, and kind man, always grinning thoughtfully, and universally beloved in the movement. Mario Leone recalled the incident. Quote, "The boss accused him of not knowing something very serious, something that made him unsuitable for the cause. I tell this story to highlight the horror of those meetings. I repeat, I did not know that Diego had fallen into disgrace, and I suppose that not even many other comrades knew. There were about 40 of us, and since it was somehow mandatory to contribute, we took the floor one after another to say poor Diego that he behaved badly and that he was to be corrected." End quote. Although Mario knew Labat was being arbitrarily scapegoated, and that any of them could find themselves in the center of the next sadistic candlelit ritual, she found a sense of security in joining. Quote, "When someone who I consider far superior to me from the militant point of view fell into disgrace, I felt a feeling of amazement and, perversely, a point of joy. What was this dark feeling? It was because one calms their feelings of the guilt of not being a great militant, or the doubts about the sect and the life we lead." End quote. After the session ended, Labat confessed to Almeida that he would hitchhike home immediately were it not for a lack of proper footwear for the muddy walk to the highway. Almeida gave him his boots, switching them out for an old Wehrmacht pair. Labat left the castle that night to meet his partner Magda. Long separated by Poseidus' decree, she had recently been expelled for disobeying orders to stay in Uruguay by going to Paris. Quote, "Only he will know what he suffered that day," Mario wrote. "I can only hope that he noticed at this meeting how crazy Poseidus was, how wicked he could be, and how we can all be just as crazy and wicked." End quote. The grotesque Congress inspired several of the participants to privately discuss the movement's darkening mood. Almeida began to float some criticisms at the cadre schools, coded in subtle questions about Poseidus' conclusions compared to quotes from the Marxist canon. In Genoa, a militant named Nicola Caazza picked up the subtle messages, pulling Almeida aside after a lecture to nervously ask if their leader had gone, quote, gaga. Pretending to agree with Poseidus was hard enough, but Almeida and his wife Ana Teresa had been separated for years by decree in order to do so. Eventually his compañera had enough and bought a boat ticket to Italy. Quote, "The decision of Anate to put her money together and reunite with me, leaving aside the submission to irrational discipline, not only liberated her from blackmail, but also gave me new strength and confidence to make my own decisions." End quote. As she approached, Almeida began to draft a 20-page criticism of what the International had become. When he joined the movement, it was, quote, democratic and a peer group, made up of brilliant and valuable people. Now it was a backwards cult, propagating, quote, absurd and ridiculous positions, the result of ignorance of Poseidus and his many young Poseidistas, and our disregard for discussing and eradicating the barbarities in time, like the flying saucers, for example. End quote. He reunited with Anata at the port of Genoa, and they took a train to Rome. at a tourist pizza shop in the center, where they were sure they wouldn't be seen, he showed her the polemic. She agreed to help complete it, knowing it would be treated as a heresy, and prepared for the worst. They found a place to stay with a coworker's sister-in-law, where they edited the document until it was ready to submit. A few days later, Leone asked to meet with Almeida at the Roman Pantheon. He was, quote, white as a sheet, shaking. Almeida recalled as he delivered the news of their expulsion. Once he was done, Almeida asked what he thought of the criticism. Leone admitted he had not read it. Presumably few, if anyone, had before the document was destroyed. Almeida urged him to forget all the lessons on centralism and monolithism he learned in the movement, and to no longer remain a part of a political organization that does not grant the right to criticize or defend oneself, lest he become, quote, a spokesman for an aberration, end quote. A year later, Almeida and Ana Teresa gave birth to the couple's first child, a son, in a Roman-free clinic for Latin American refugees. In the waiting room, Guillermo saw his oldest comrade. Gilly sheepishly greeted him by party name and handed over his number, whispering, quote, do not tell him you saw me, end quote. He later explained on the phone the chaos that unfolded just days after Almeida's expulsion. One night, an Argentine comrade staying at Posadas' villa awoke to find his girlfriend was not in bed. His search of the house led to the master bedroom, where he turned on the light to find her performing fellatio on Posadas. The young comrade's shouts awoke the rest of the inner circle, who gathered in the kitchen to argue about what had occurred. It was clear Posadas had broken his own moral code, but in the weeks that followed, he deflected his crime against his inner circle by accusing them of the same promiscuity. It began with his driver, a man from Florence, who shuttled blindfolded militants between Rome and the villa. One day the driver was banned without explanation. Then Posadas began to make vague criticisms against Sierra. Leone gathered Posadas was accusing her of infidelity, but it was unclear if he was being literal or metaphorical. He remembered her responding, quote, with an almost autistic attitude, silence, very little eating, no admission of guilt, but no defense against the accusations, end quote. Telling his militants that he refused to be a cuckold, he sent Sierra to live in the German section. His farewell speech for her was just as vague as the accusations, and disturbingly as cold as all his rare deferences to her in internal documents. Neither her political nor domestic contributions to the movement were ever acknowledged. She was only just a, quote, function of history that had apparently outlived its usefulness. As he pushed out his wife, Posadas developed an interest in a young Argentine militant named Inez. He accused her husband, Marcos, of indiscipline and sent him away, leaving Inez at the villa to do everything Sierra had once done. Leona realized, quote, wiping his back after football matches, preparing the mate, and so on, end quote. Soon, he came to make the same vague criticisms against Inez that he had made against Sierra, and in the final weeks of 1974, a full year after these obsessive speeches on sexual impropriety, began to expel his inner circle one by one. During the process, he finally made his accusations clear. He believed Sierra and Inez had been, quote, fucking more or less all the men who had been expelled, end quote, Leone wrote. Posadas knew this was happening because he could hear an unmistakable chordal creaking of furniture from his bedroom. First came Dante Minazzoli, then the rest of the old team. Gilly, DeFranco, Dauder, and the rest. Leone entered a period of mental crisis, conditioned to believe everything Posadas said while knowing none of it was true. He secretly met with a weeping Minazzoli, contemplating jumping in the Tiber. Minazzoli begged him to leave the group. Quote, if we accepted this madness, he told him, we have stopped thinking. Leone witnessed another awful incident involving De Franco. With nowhere to go after his expulsion, Alicio Fajardo allowed him to stay with him in the Roman Comuna. Poseres exploded into a violent rage when he found him there, swinging a chair at his fellow refugee and longtime secretary until he was repelled for good. In the weeks that followed, Leone watched Poseres replace his court with a totally new group of mostly young Europeans. Their motivations for joining the movement were far different than the intellectual youth moved to revolutionary action and organization from Leone's generation. They were instead, quote, more looking for a trusted paternal figure than political activity. Even understanding that Poseres was mad, Leone stayed with the group and busied his mind with party work. He read a book about dialectical materialism and offered it to Poseres in hopes it would similarly distract him. When Poseres visited the Leone house shortly after, Piero asked what he thought of it. Quote, but he did not care about the book, he wrote, as he did not care about books in general. End quote. Finally allowing himself to become angry, he blacked out with rage. Mario remembered what happened next. Quote, for a few moments, maybe seconds, although they seemed like hours, all breathing stopped. End quote. As he finally unleashed his words on Poseres. Quote, you have always argued that your greatest historical merit was to have built a leadership team capable of taking on the tasks that revolution implies. At the same time, it should be said that if the accusations against major members of this team are true, you have in fact not built a team, but a brothel. Consequently, either you have failed completely, or we should recognize now that the team you built was valid. I don't know why, but I think there's a hole in your head. End quote. Poseres cursed Leone and quickly left his house, ordering a still neutral Mario to come along to his villa. That night he denounced Piero to his new team and invited Mario to do the same. This time she refused. They were kicked out of the political bureau, but Piero was still not ready to leave. He begged to continue distributing the newspaper to prove himself worthy. After a pathetic first outing, he realized it was over and agreed to quit. In a farewell speech to Leone, Poseres sarcastically said he regretted losing the longtime militant and Italian section founder, but said he was sure they would find another male boy. In another speech to the new IS on the 3rd of August 1974, Poseres announced his partnership with Inez in a lengthy speech. Earlier that year, she, quote, admitted her faults, the many acts of adultery, and thanks to that had been forgiven, Leone recalled. In an effort to, quote, reconstruct her crimes, the two had united. He only acknowledged his hypocrisy in purely political terms. Quote, the necessity of a compañera is not a sexual problem. I don't need a compañera for this. I can get by. But instead, for elevating the life effect and power, to have a method to elevate the effect of life. Now, in this, I have found a compañera, to build and develop feelings, awareness and resolution of affections, that would allow her to build herself as a militant and leader, and to serve me to develop my capacity for feelings of conscience, my capacity for organizing. End quote. A few months after the announcement, a new task and a new stage of the International announced itself without Poseres needing to say a word. Inez was pregnant. End of section.